it's a real honor to be able to give a short lecture, and I want to talk about the intersection of Ayurvedic medicine and allopathic medicine in rheumatoid arthritis. It relates to an AYUSH sponsored collaborative study. These are my disclosures. I work with many different companies to get my research done. We know about Ayurvedic medicine. It's got a very long tradition. It's well known in India and several other countries, but it's not really respected to the degree that it might be. And in part, this is because it's not been truly proven by today's scientific medicine. You saw Dr. Schneider's articles, which were quite good. I didn't notice, however, that they were double blind, and that's sort of the gold standard. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how we might be able to do that. I want to talk about the pilot study, and I want to specifically concentrate on the upcoming AMRA study with respect to rationale and all the other things you see there. We know RA is as prevalent in India as it is anywhere else, with about 0.75% of patients. So that puts it in the range of 5 to 10 million patients in India with RA. And the genetic profile in India is not uniform, and in fact is not the same as in the Caucasian population. We know it as a systemic disease, and I'm not going to go through all that, but it's much more than simply a disease of the joints. And the result of that is that the outcome can be pretty bad. In patients who are rheumatoid factor positive, you can see here that there's a significantly decreased survival curve compared to those who have RA and are rheumatoid factor negative. And it really can be pretty bad. Now, this is an old study. Nevertheless, the truth remains. The way we test for it is we examine the various joints in a very validated and careful method that you see here. And the result of that is a combined measure called the disease activity score, among other things. And you can see in the bottom that it includes tender joints, swollen joints, the ESR, and a patient global in a very complex formula that includes square roots and natural logs and weird things. But the fact is that it's well validated and it really works. In the past, with the Ayurvedic Trust in Coimbatore, we did a pilot study. It was NIH, National Institute of Health in the United States, supported. And it looked at methotrexate, classic outpatient Ayurveda, and their combination in rheumatoid arthritis. It included the people you see here, including Krishna Kumar, Ram Manohar, who is leading today, and a number of other individuals that really made this whole thing work. The trial was this, with a screening and a baseline, and then randomization. Small numbers of patients, you'll notice. What was different about this, and I'll talk much more about this in the future, is that it was double blind. It required multiple placebos, in fact, 8 placebos, and a double-blind technique. And the only people who knew about this were the 2 pharmacists. Everybody else was blinded. Furthermore, the patients themselves did not interact with the pharmacist, so it really remained double-blind. There was also an uninvolved medical safety officer, so that that person too did not interact with people who were looking at the outcomes. We were able to show that, in fact, it remained double-blind. And what you'd expect if it were double-blind is that the people in each group would be wrong 2/3 of the time because there were 3 groups. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. So we know that this was a successful blinding of the study. The results showed some interesting results. If you look at patient pain or patient global response, there was no difference over 36 weeks between methotrexate and Ayurveda. The combination, although not statistically different because the numbers were so small, looked a little less good than either drug alone. One could imagine interference with absorption, for example. And if you look at the DAS-28, the combined measure, you can see that the effects were consistent. What about side effects? Because you never get something for nothing. Well, there were a number of side effects, both for the Ayurvedic medicine and the methotrexate group, with about twice as many in the methotrexate group, and perhaps a trend towards more side effects in the combination. In that study, this was, as far as we know, the first double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled study comparing those 3 combinations. And we were able to get placebos for the full array of the traditional dosage forms. And we showed that this is possible. So what we've done is we've set up a 36-week randomized, double-blind, double-done controlled study for Ayurveda versus methotrexate in RA, the AMRA study. And I want to explain some of this to you. It was really, it was required to set up a relatively complex structure with an independent monitoring committee, a joint monitoring committee, 3 sites, and multiple other individuals to make this work. And the idea was to look at this combined measure called the DAS-28 CRP and compare patients with Ayurveda versus methotrexate. Given what we found in the combination, we thought that was not an appropriate arm for this study. We wanted to look at another combined measure that's been validated called the American College of Rheumatology response criteria. And we wanted to look at 20%, 50%, and 70% responses, as well as the DAS-28. We want to look at remission. And importantly, we want to look at the immunological response. And you see here some of the cytokines, the CRP, polymorphonuclear chemotaxis, etc. So we'd get a feel for the immunological response. And of course, we wanted to compare adverse events. Furthermore, although the HAQ-DI, the Health Assessment Questionnaire Disability Index, had been looked at previously in the Indian population, some of these other forms had never been validated. So we want to look at those in the Indian population for future use. The SF-36 is a standard quality of life form. We want to look at sleep, depression. The Clinical Disease Activity Index, which is a simplified way of looking at a combined measure. We want to look at a measure which can be done without actually having the physicians or assistants actually do joint counts. And we want to look at fatigue. So beyond the other things, we wanted to help provide outcome measures that can be useful in other aspects of rheumatoid arthritis. The outline is what you see here. Screening and baseline, and then randomization to methotrexate plus Ayurvedic placebo or Ayurveda plus methotrexate placebo. And we wanted to go for 36 weeks because we wanted to be sure there was sufficient time for Ayurvedic medicine to work. Double blind, randomized, double dummy, as we said before. I want to go a little bit through a little bit of the rationale for this. For the reasons I showed you before, we want to look at only two different therapies, Ayurveda versus methotrexate. And based on the results in the pilot study and the effect size of the pilot study, we needed 109 patients per arm to get a power of 0.9 for the primary objective. So we needed to get 218 patients. We wanted to look at well-validated measures because one of our goals is to be able to say to the world as a whole that whatever we find is fully credible to anyone, even people who are very skeptical about Ayurveda. And then we wanted to look at those cytokines that I mentioned to you in order to show that these treatments and drugs had an effect on the immune system in a double-blind trial. We're doing it in India because that's where Ayurveda has a classical background. We wanted to be sure these patients, no one had any doubt that they had rheumatoid arthritis by allopathic criteria. So they had to have either rheumatoid factor or CCP, which means the patients had seropositive disease. And we wanted to be sure that people understood that these patients had serious disease. So we were requiring erosions or breakdown of the joints in these patients before they entered the trial. We needed 3 centers, and this is the next step in doing these trials, because first, there were a lot of patients, and secondly, by doing that, we can prove that we understand and know how to do multi-center trials, double-blind, which is something we'll talk about more, in multiple centers. As I said before, we wanted 9 months in duration to ensure time for response. Another thing that we wanted to do was train each center and all of the clinical coordinators in each center and the clinical research scientists how to do the joint counts, requiring me to go there and teach, which of course, because of COVID-19 has been totally delayed, but we'll get started pretty soon. And we wanted to be sure that we could use the whole system of outpatient Ayurvedic therapy so that the physicians, the Ayurvedic physicians, can individualize their therapy as is appropriate for this system of medicine. We got informed consent. We had standardized inclusion and exclusion criteria. We even have an algorithm for getting the methotrexate dose up to the standard dose, and paired changes. I'll show you this to ensure blinding. Here's what we did. We started at a low dose and in 2-week increments went up by the standard 2.5 milligrams a week. It's an oral medication, all the way up to what is now the standard in allopathic medicine, 25 milligrams per week if the patient tolerated. Of course, if they didn't, you go up to the highest possible dose for the patient to continue. Now, there were multiple placebos, and blinding is so critical. I want to review this in some detail. By blinding, we can individualize the therapy. And what we did was we got, or getting, blinding of each of the pharmacological dosage forms that you see here, as well as the medicated oils. So that since these dosage forms are the ones used, we wanted to be sure that we could do placebos for each one. These things will be formulated and tested both for blinding and stability and safety. So, for example, we wanted to be sure that if there was a kashayam, that the placebo looked and tasted like the true form, which required a great deal of work. And by doing this, we'll be able to say in the future, this kind of placebo-controlled trial can be done by all physicians interested in well-done, double-blind controlled studies in rheumatoid arthritis. There was one placebo to represent all formulations in a given dosage form. Color, appearance, texture, smell, all of those had to remain appropriate and blinded. Remember that our pilot study really did show that this was possible. But we're doing it a little bit more in a more standardized method, in a well-documented method, in numbers large enough so that we can take care of over 200 patients over a 36-week period. The methotrexate 2 had to be controlled by placebo. And so a licensed pharmaceutical company in India will manufacture that. In order to keep things blinded, if a treatment is changed in one group, it really needs to be changed in the other, because if you had one where nothing ever changed in a group, it would clearly be unblinded for the patient and for anyone who saw this. So what we did was we're pairing subjects, and this is what happens. If a subject one, let's say, is using Ayurvedic and methotrexate placebo, an equivalent subject will use methotrexate and Ayurvedic placebo. So each patient would be paired with another patient. All changes will occur in both groups. And so it's not possible to break the blind either for the subjects or the investigators, although the investigators aren't supposed to know about this. It could happen, so we want to guard against that. So the patients won't see the actual prescriptions. The only people who know what's going on will be the pharmacists, and there'll be a central pharmacist doing that. And the physicians won't discuss the prescription with the patients or ask them about what's going on. And even if they did, they couldn't tell. Another thing that's super important is that we will have oversight to maintain data quality. And it'll be done by what's called good clinical practice, which is a standardized way of oversight that carefully looks at the records, looks at the pharmacy, etc. And as I mentioned before, all of the personnel will be specifically trained for measuring RA, looking at standardization of the joint counts. And then the monitors will visit each site when they first get started after 1 to 3 patients. And then about every 6 months, and they'll go over the charts. They'll compare the charts to the case report forms. They will see what physically is occurring so that we have the highest standards of clinical trials, and that there can be no question from the point of view of the publication of these results that we have truly credible results. As I mentioned before, of course, you have to have definition of your statistical methods beforehand. And with 91 patients per group, you get a power of 0.9. We assume a 20% dropout, so you need 109 patients per group. We also will include measures to look at how to deal with missing data. You know, there are 5 different ways of looking at missing data, and we'll choose one of them with the help of our various committees to be sure that that's pre-programmed into the statistics. So this study is defined by the previous NIH-sponsored study, and it showed that placebos and double blinding can be successfully implemented in this multimodal traditional medical system so that there can be no question about the credibility. And it builds on the innovation from the NIH-sponsored trial. Best of our knowledge, there are no formalized clinical trial research training program of the kind we've proposed in India. We may have missed it, but we don't think so. It'll establish a multi-center infrastructure so that this can be done multiple times in different populations. And it'll corroborate the validity of the tools used in the pilot study and development of further multilingual tools. We're aiming for 5 different languages. I think this will help establish Ayurvedic physicians as outstanding researchers and enhance the image of Ayurveda. It should, and I expect it will, attract additional talented young Indians and other nationals to the study of Ayurveda. And it'll show that traditional medicine can be tested fully scientifically. So at bottom line, we will test Ayurvedic therapy versus methotrexate according to the highest standards, and we'll develop an Ayurvedic medicine to independently or collaboratively undertake excellent clinical research in the field of RA therapy. Thank you so much for your attention.